Alright, so we're going to be going through chapter 2, which is. I really need to stop using a physical copy. Alright, chapter 2 is the process of exchange. So, right here, he's talking about what happens when commodity owners go to the market. So, at the first paragraph, it says commodities themselves cannot go to market and perform exchanges in their own right. We must therefore have recourse to their guardians, who are the possessors of commodities. Commodities are things and therefore lack the power to resist man. If they are unwilling, he can use force. In other words, he can take possession of them. In order that these objects may enter into relation with other commodities, their guardians must place themselves in relation to another person. So obviously, commodities can't just walk into the market and sell themselves. They have to be brought in by their owners. So if you go to 179, it says in the middle, for the owner, his commodity possesses no direct use value. Otherwise, he would not bring it to the market. It has use values for others, but for himself, its only direct use value is a bearer of exchange value, and consequently a means of exchange. So if you have a book and you're done reading the book and you want to sell the book, the use value of the book becomes its value, which is what he's saying there. And then he says at the bottom, on the other hand, they must stand the test as use values before they can be realized as values, for the labor expended on them only counts insofar as it is expended in a form which is useful for others. So you can't make a mud pie because it's not useful. It doesn't have a use value. And it says, however, only the act of exchange can prove whether that labor is useful for others and its product consequently capable of satisfying the needs of others. So it's through exchange that we get labor being useful. And then it says, down on 180, let us look at the matter a little more closely. To the owners of a commodity, every other commodity counts as the particular equivalent of his own commodity. Hence, his own commodity is the universal equivalent for all others. So, when he compares his commodity, it's no longer a commodity, it's no longer a book that has a use value. It's simply a block of objectified human labor when you exchange commodities. And then it says at the bottom, but only the action of society can turn a particular commodity into the universal equivalent. The social action of all their commodities therefore sets apart the particular commodity in which they all represent their values. The natural form of this commodity thereby becomes the socially recognized equivalent form, which is basically reinforcing the idea that you are comparing your exchange value to all other exchange values because you want their use value. And then it says at the top of 181, money necessarily crystallizes out of the process of exchange in which different products of labor are in fact equated with each other and thus converted into commodities. The historical broadening and deepening of the phenomenon of exchange develops the opposition between use value and value, which is latent in the nature of the commodity. So Marx will point out a bunch of contradictions in Capital. And one of the contradictions he sees is a contradiction between value and use value, because an object has two characters in it, a commodity, which is its use value and its value, and that's a contradiction to him. What else was I going to say about that? Okay, moving on to 182. I'm not going to read all this, but this part is very, very important. Basically, money arrives out of a money arrives to be the universal equivalent. So rather than going out and taking your chair somewhere and trading your chair, and then someone trades their couch, they trade a object that has no use value but its exchange value, and that object is money. And money becomes eventually the form in which all commodities are measured in their exchange value. And money is not capitalism. If you have money, that doesn't make you capitalist. Here, give me a sec. Okay, I'm back. Anyway, yeah, money isn't capitalism. Money isn't, if you have money, that doesn't make you, capitalism. That doesn't make it capitalism. An example is the Romans. So the Romans actually traded with money, but they weren't capitalists. And another society would be some of the early primitive societies after the agricultural revolutions traded with money, but they weren't capitalist. So money is not a part of capitalism. So if you're arguing with the trot like me, like I am right now, and if they ever say that, a society has money, therefore it's capitalist, well, no, Marx himself said that money is not inherent to capitalism, but money arises as like a precursor to capitalism. And I have a note. In primitive society, exchange value is random. In a society of commodities, the use less exchange value contradictions come into play. So in primitive society, exchange value was random. So if you go out and hunt for 10 berries and you get 15 berries, you know, you're technically engaging in commodity exchange, but that doesn't make you capitalist. What capitalism is when the entire society, including the means of production, um, and including labor power, are sold as commodities. And I have another note. Use value is a commodity when it gets its dual nature. So the dual nature of a commodity is its exchange value and its use value. And the exchange value is just a fluctuation from value, which is the socially necessary labor time. And another note is commodities use value for its owner is its exchange value. And moving on from there, we go to 184. And then towards the bottom of 184, it says the money commodity acquires a dual use value. Alongside its special use value as a commodity, gold, for instance, serves to fill hollow teeth. It forms the raw material for luxury articles, etc. It acquires a formal use value, arriving out of its specific social function. Since all other commodities are merely particular equivalents for money, the latter being their universal equivalent, they relate to money as particular commodities relate to the universal commodity. So gold really became the universal commodity because it could be melted. You can make it into coins. You can smith with it, and it um, it's very hard and it's easy to carry around, and that's how gold and silver became money. And all commodities eventually started to become measured in gold. And then going to 186, towards the bottom, it says money, like every other commodity, cannot express the magnitude of its value except relatively to other commodities. This value is determined by the labor time required for its production and is expressed in the quantity of any other commodity in which the same amount of labor time is congealed. So you can't really express the value of gold or money or any commodity on its own. You have to compare it to another commodity. And at the bottom of 187, it says, their own relations of production therefore assume a material shape which is independent of the control and the consciousness of individual action. This situation is manifested first by the fact that the products of men's labor universally takes on the form of commodities. So the products of men's labor universally take on the form of commodities. So everything becomes a commodity. Um, the riddle of the money fetish is therefore the riddle of the commodity fetish, now become visible and dazzling to our eyes. So what Marx believed is that money wasn't actually an equivalent exchange because of the fluctuation from value with exchange value. So Marx didn't believe that um, we were all trading for equivalent exchange because we weren't trading for the socially necessary labor time. And then really quick, I'm going to do something a bit different. Let's jump to the chapter on variable and constant capital. So you can just control F, and it's on page 307, constant and variable capital. So You can just control F and find it. So this is something that's extremely important to value theory, which I don't know why Marx didn't include earlier in the book, but essentially what we have with value is we have um, the human labor producing value. So value can only come from human labor. Now in capitalism, we have basically two transfers of value. We have variable capital, and if you control F and type in variable capital, it's the second one, and it says it's on page, oh fuck, that's the introduction. There we go. It's on page, let me find where he defines it. There we go. It's on page 317 towards the bottom, and he says, I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or more briefly, variable capital. And going up, it says, that part of capital which is turned into labor power does not undergo an alteration of value in the process of production. It both reproduces the equivalence of its own value and produces an excess, surplus value, which it may itself vary and be more or less according to circumstances. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it variable capital. So the actual part of commodity production that produces value is human labor. And that human labor is called variable capital because the amount of value that it produces is a variable, it changes. And in the labor theory of value, variable capital will essentially be a wage. And looking for constant capital, if you control F and find constant capital, okay, it's on page 317. It says the part of capital, therefore, which is turned into means of production, that is, the raw material, the auxiliary material, and the instruments of labor, does not undergo any quantitative alteration of value in the process of production. For this reason, I call it the constant part of capital, or more briefly, constant capital. So the means of production and every other raw material that goes into production has value, right? Because um, ultimately, to make those, you have to have variable capital, which remember is the human labor, it's the wage, and you have to have surplus value, which is the unpaid portion of the labor. So if a worker works for 10 hours and they only receive in the variable capital or in the wage 5 hours of pay, then the other 5 hours of value produced is going to be surplus value. It's going to be what the capitalist gets. So surplus value is unpaid labor. And the worker is producing constant capital. Constant capital is your machineries, your oils, and your means of production. And constant capital does not create value. Constant capital just redistributes the value that was put into it by human labor. So, in the labor theory of value, you basically have constant capital, which is the value of the means of production, variable capital, which is the wage or the human labor, and then surplus value, which is the unpaid labor. And you may say, well, how do we calculate the part of constant capital? Basically, every block of constant capital can be reduced to another block of constant capital plus variable capital plus surplus value. So if you have like a book, you may say, well, what's the value of this book? Well, you have to go back and look at the machines that made that book. So that would be C, V, and S. That would be constant and variable and surplus value. And then you have to look at the human labor time that went into making the parts for the machine itself and to simply create the machine in the first place. And that would be another block of C, V, and S. And then eventually, all constant capital, all means of production, have to eventually boil down into variable capital, which is human labor, the wage, and surplus value. So that's basically how it works. And that's it for chapter 2. So
That was pretty short.
Yeah, it's short.
It's a short chapter.
It is.
Um, at one point, you said that having money doesn't make someone a capitalist.
Yeah.
What does make someone a capitalist?
So, to be a capitalist, you have to do two things. You have to buy means of production, and you have to buy labor power. And the means of production are used to create commodities, and the human labor is used to create commodities but also add value. And then you take those products and you sell them, the surplus value, and you sell it. That's what makes you a capitalist.
So, what about working class people who identify as uh, capitalist ideologically?
Well, economically, they wouldn't be considered a capitalist. They would just be considered, I don't know, a neoliberal, I guess.
So, then economically, what would make someone a socialist?
Economically make someone a socialist? Well, socialism is a German word. I mean, it really just means someone who advocates for the end of capitalism. But I mean, like, an economically socialist society, you wouldn't have generalized commodity production. Um, you wouldn't have producing for exchange value or for profit, and you wouldn't have wage labor. You wouldn't be hiring workers and extracting surplus value from them.
Would a like a market socialist kind of model with like worker cops, would that be considered a socialist model, for example?
No, I don't. I don't consider that to be socialist. I mean, technically, like not socialist, but a society can have like worker co-ops, but can be moving towards socialism. But that's not like technically socialism.
So would you say that's more like a transitional stage?
Yeah, definitely.
So what makes a market socialist, or like, um, yeah, a market socialist not real socialism? Is it because they have to like take their own surplus value and reinvest it, or
Yeah, basically they underpay themselves so that they can get more capital. Because all capital is a society where all capitalism is just a society where everything becomes a commodity. So, everything is still a commodity. The difference is that just everyone works for themselves or works in a co-op, but they still have to like undercut themselves and they still have to produce for profit. So that's why it technically wouldn't be socialist.
Okay.
Just out of interest, were we just going to cover chapter 1 this evening, or were we going to do
it's
chapter
chapter
3 as
two?
well? Okay, great, thanks.
Um, I mean, we can do we can do three, but three is kind of big.
I mean,
Should
we
probably
could
save
do
that for next time then.
could do
Yeah.
like half of it, since this has been like 5 minutes.
All
It
right,
Yeah, let's
feels
bet.
do
like
it
it's
like
been
that.
a 5 minute call.
All right, bet.
Alright.
All right. Let's go on to three. Now, there's basically in three, he's describing the ways that money can be used. So I'm just gonna kind of paraphrase a bit. Um, so let's go to the first means of money. Money, commodity, labor, price relations. Okay, so at 193 at the bottom, it says a general rise in the prices of commodity can either result from a rise in their values, which happens when the value of money remains constant, or from a fall in the value of money, which happens when the values of commodities remain constant. The process also occurs in reverse. A general fall in prices can either result from a fall in the value of commodities if the value of money remains constant, or from a rise in the value of money if the values of commodity remain constant. It therefore by no means follows that a rise in the value of money necessarily implies a proportional fall in the prices of commodities, or that a fall in the value of money implies a proportional rise in prices. This would only hold for commodities whose value remains constant, but commodities whose value rise simultaneously with and in the proportion to that of money would retain the same price. And if their value rose either slower or faster than that of money, the fall or rise in prices would be determined by the difference between the path described by their value and that described by the value of money, and so on. So what this paragraph is basically saying is the divergence between price and I wish this dude would leave me alone. Is the divergence between price and value. So price is determined by um, supply and demand. When you bring a commodity to the market, there's going to be a supply and demand. It's going to be determined by supply and demand, but the value is determined by the socially necessary labor time. And here he's just talking about the divergences between um, money value and commodity value. And then here he talks about the development of money across the world. I'm trying to get to the part where he talks about money as a means of payment. Okay, so at 196, it says, suppose two equal quantities of socially necessary labor are respectively represented by 1/4 of wheat and 2 pounds. 2 pounds is the expression of money in the magnitude of the value of the quarter of wheat, or its price. If the circumstances now allow this price to be raised to 3 pounds, or compel it to be reduced to 1 pound, then, although 1 pound and 3 pound may be too small or too large to give proper expressions of the magnitude of the wheat's value, they are nevertheless the prices of the wheat, for they are, in the first place, the form of its value, that is money, and in the second place, the exponents of its exchange ratio with money. If the conditions of production or the socially necessary or the productivity of labor remain constant, the same amount of social necessary labor time must be expended on the reproduction of a quarter of wheat, both before and after the change in price. So you can have money go above and below the value of wheat. Wheat can be 1 pound or it can be 3 pound. It would still have the same socially necessary labor time. And then it says at the bottom, the possibility, therefore, of a quantitative incongruity between price and magnitude of value, that is, the possibility that price may diverge from the magnitude of value, is inherent in the price form itself. So it's inherent that prices may diverge from value, which is why he believes it's not equivalent exchange. He says this is not a defect, but on the contrary, it makes this form the adequate one for a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves as blindly operating averages between constant irregularities. So he's saying that the fact that value, because of the chaos of production, value is, or exchange value constantly fluctuating, just simply meets the fact that there's constant competition in capitalism. And I just have a note, it says prices hide value, value into prices, and values may not equal price. And then at 197 it says at the bottom of the first paragraph, on the other hand, the imaginary price form may also conceal a real value relation or one derived from it, as for instance the price of uncultivated land, which is without value because no human labor is objectified in it. So you can have you can have the price form, so you can have prices for goods without actually having a value. And he talked about that in chapter 1 when he talked about acts of chivalry or uncultivated land. These are products without value, but they have prices. And it says, like the relative form of value in general, price expresses the value of a commodity by asserting that a given quantity of the equivalent, for instance, an ounce of gold, is directly exchangeable with iron, but it by no means asserts the converse, that iron is directly exchangeable with gold. In order, therefore, that a commodity may in practice operate effectively as exchange value, it must divest itself of its natural physical body and become transformed from merely imaginary into real gold. Although this act of transubstantiation may be more troublesome for it than the transition from necessary to freedom for the Hegelian concept. So basically, a commodity, iron or whatnot, has to, when it's being exchanged, become like pseudo gold. Like it ceases to have its use value. Its use value is its exchange value. Okay, so we get into 198, the parts of money. So we have the means of circulation. So money is a means of circulation. So money is what is able to have exchange between commodities because of its socially necessary labor time. Um, that's basically the means of circulation. And going on to 200, this is a very, very important part of capital. He talks about the first, what he calls a circuit at the bottom. And he's talking about the example of, what would you call it? Like someone who creates linen, and like a tailor or whatever. And he's talking about how this is the first primordial sort of step into capitalism, is basic commodity exchange. And he represents it with the example of a home Bible into money, into or linen. Basically, the tailor sells linen for money, which he receives for a home Bible. And he represents that. He says the process of exchange is therefore accomplished through the following changes of form. So I'm a tailor, right? And I have linen. I go to the market and I buy a Bible. Now I've just exchanged in commodity exchange. My linen became a commodity. It no longer had a use value for me. Its use value was its exchange value. I got that for money, and right now money is being used as a means of exchange. So I'm using money to get a use value that I actually will consume. So if I go out, create a computer, I sell it for money, and then I use that money to buy Doritos and I eat them, those Doritos are no longer physically in the world. They're no longer able to be exchanged. So money as a means of circulation just means that you're using money in order to basically take one use value, right, which is the linen, and then you're using money, which is just simply representing labor time, and then you're using that money as a mediator to get to the Bible. So your goal isn't to like get capital. Your goal isn't to become a capitalist. What your goal is to change one use value into another use value by using money. And then right here, he goes on like a lot about commodity into money and then money into commodity. But if you just simply understand that the circuit CMC, wheat, money, linen, is simply, or linen, money, Bible, is just you trying to use money to get another exchange value. So we don't need to go over the metamorphosis of the two parts of the circuit. So let's skip to where he talks about MCM prime. Okay, we get to 210.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, what's up?
Circular flow of income. Circular flow of income, like how exchange is made. How would it work in socialism? Because I've got the diagram up and I'm just a bit confused.
Oh, the secular flow of income?
Yeah, but
Well,
for like socialism,
oh,
or
for
in the way of Marxism.
well, the secular form of income wouldn't work because you wouldn't have You wouldn't have factory to consumer exchange. You would have a planned economy.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
The whole goal of socialism is to stop exchanging shit, basically.
That makes sense. Okay. Alright.
Yeah.
That's why the diagram is a bit weird.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, at 210, we got the juicy stuff. We got the circulation of money. So it says the change of form through which the metabolism of the products of labor is accomplished. CMC requires that a given value form shall form from the starting point of the process in the shape of a commodity and that it will return to the same point in the shape of a commodity. So all you're trying to do is just get another commodity with the use value you want to consume. So skipping ahead, let me find, this is a long chapter. Let me find where he talks about MCM. Coin, symbol of value. So let me talk about token money. I guess he doesn't get to MCM in this chapter. Let me talk about token money. So back in the day, we used to exchange for equivalents in barter. So one person would sell a horse for a carriage, and those horse and carriages would have equal quantities of labor time. And they did this, for example, in feudal Japan, and that was how they exchanged. They also exchanged for equivalents with gold and silver. And if they had 20 hours of gold going into creating, if they had 20 hours of creating gold and then they had 20 hours of creating a boat, then they would exchange for equivalents. And then what happened is you had something called token money. Now, token money is where you exchange for less than value. So back in the day, gold would get carried around. It would ride on carriages. It would fall off and it would chip, and it would go under its legal weight. So rather than 8 ounces of gold, you'd have like 7.5 or 7 ounces. And then, got work tomorrow morning. Okay. Anyway, yeah, it will. Oh fuck, he's not even in the Discord. I'm retarded. Okay. What's it called? Um, so you would have it be under its legal weight, and you would exchange not for equivalence, but you would exchange representing that labor time. So even though your gold may not represent 8 hours of labor, you just exchange it as like basically an IOU, and that's basically the origin of credit. And eventually, you get down into banks issuing out paper tokens, basically IOUs. And then as those banks become more and more centralized, eventually all of society will use token money. And that's what modern day pounds or dollars or rupees are just token money. They don't represent real value. So hoarding, right here Marx talks about the different aspects of money hoarding. So the two main aspects of money is that it circulates and it accumulates. So you circulate money and you accumulate money. And circulating and accumulating money is a big part of capitalism. He just talks about hoarding money. People would hoard money instead of hoarding goods because it's a lot easier to get stuff with money than it is to get stuff with trying to sell goods. And means of payment, I'll just skip this. Means of payment. World money. On 240C, world money, he basically talks about how the world begins to use money as, and money is good as well, which is something I forgot to mention. Money is good as well because it's the most efficient way to trade stuff. rather than carrying around your horse or your yacht or something, you just carry around money. So it's the best way to trade things. So yeah, that's basically it for chapter 3. Oh yeah, duh, he talks about MCM in the next chapter, of course. Alright, anyway, that's it for chapter 3. It's a lot of deep algebraic analysis, and it's good to read, but it's not really necessary.
I think I had a question earlier, and it was something to do with how how you said money doesn't equal the amount of labor time that is put into something because it gets
Yeah.
distorted by supply and demand. Um, but like, what would be the implications of that in a society? So like, why would that be a bad thing?
Well, Marx didn't think it was a bad thing. Marx thought it was a necessary thing. Because of competition, because technology is always advancing, he thought it was a necessary thing for capitalism.
All right.
Yeah, to add on that, if value did not equal the price, a capitalist will just fail every time.
Yeah, that's another thing I
Oh
should
yeah,
mention
yeah, true.
because
Yeah, true, true.
I did go over constant capital briefly. Basically, we see today McDonald's, especially like in the UK and whatnot, is starting to fire their workers and they're starting to replace everything with 100% automation. But the thing is you can't exploit machines. You can't make machines work and then not pay them. Because if you have like $100 worth of a machine and every day for 100 days it distributes $1 worth of value, there's no way that you can exploit it. So if an economy was to have 100% constant capital, or if a capitalist economy were to be like 100% automated, it would just completely fail. Like it would explode of its own impossibility. So we
Is
need,
that because no workers are getting paid to like spend any money, or
yeah, that's part of it, but it's also because um like 100% of what you produce is going to be 100% of your inputs. Even if you like mass produce stuff, all you're doing is just flooding the market with like cheap goods. So your profits are going to go down. Oh fuck, now I can't upload this. Or actually I can, but okay.
You can make it into two parts, maybe.
Yeah, I just gotta stop opening my Discord on stream.
um, but with that automation thing that you said that how it would collapse, doesn't a machine still require maintenance, like in terms of electricity and things like that? So wouldn't it be the same as like a worker, but like obviously a lot less, but it would be more of a like a wage? It would be this similar to a wage in terms of you need electricity to make the machine run.
Yeah, that's all constant capital, but basically the fundamental idea is to make it simple is if I go out and I get a worker and I work him for 10 hours and he produces 10 hours of value and I only pay him for 5 hours of value, I'm
Yeah.
going to make a profit. And with
Hmm.
machines, you can't do that. Like you can't just like, you know, buy a machine for $90 and then force it to produce like $100 worth of value.
You can only produce as much as it is able to.
Yeah, basically. If you have 100% machinery, then capitalism would completely collapse. Which is why they're trying to also do shit like UBI, but
All right then.
so is UBI just some kind of like method to keep capitalism going?
oh shit. UBI. I swear, one day I'm gonna get poisoned by the vape juice coming into my mouth. UBI originally started out as an ANCAP theory called a negative income tax. And basically the whole idea was to keep people buying consumer goods so that when they were automated out, they wouldn't have the inability to pay for goods. So yeah, like UBI started out as like kind of like an ANCAP idea, but it started out as something called reverse income tax
Mm.
or negative income tax.
All right.
Do you think in the future you could stream on Discord the book as you're reading it, so that like we can see what you're looking at?
Yeah, I definitely might.
Oh yeah, because you jump around a bit quickly, like you say,
Yeah.
oh, page 270, and then you don't give us time to like go there. You just start reading.
Yeah, I'll chill out. It's just I'm paranoid about opening my Discord on stream. But yeah, I definitely will.
But you got something to hide.
Absolutely.
Oh, you can, what do you call it? Make the stream just apply on your web page. You don't need to share your screen.
Yeah, I've heard of that, but I'd have to go into OBS. Yeah, I'll do that probably.
Not even with OBS, just with the screen share. You can just, it gives you a selection of applications you can pick on.
Yeah, for sure. I'll definitely do that. I
Right,
think
that
we're
was
good.
about an hour, right? That was like an hour.
Yeah, that's good.
We've
Yeah.
been here for an hour.
Yeah, something like that.
We've,
Yeah, roughly like that.
it's felt like 10 minutes. Jesus.
Marx is interesting, I guess.
So,
Yeah, we just blew through
Yeah.
it.
one thing I noticed in my reading of this chapter is that Marx seems to put forth this idea that money always has a material basis, and that historically gold has been like a money commodity. What would you say the current money commodity is?
Just token paper money is the current one.
Or plastic, because UK, we're not going on paper now. It's all plastic now, basically.
Yeah, and pig fat.
Yeah, sure.
Oh mate, are we still gonna be able to buy like fake money?
Oh, fuck.
Is that still a thing?